كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli wa nusallimu ala rasulihil kareem. Amma ba'd. Hope everyone's doing well. So, welcome to our fourth session, in which we are taking, as I mentioned, a dive in some of the issues in relation to general fiqh principles, and we're going to be, as I mentioned, looking at some of the other madhahib and their principles, which we will get to eventually. I did promise a bit earlier, but there have been some discussions that are pertinent that we're trying to get through first, inshallah. Now, one of the questions, or one thing that we're going to look at today, and if we get to finish it earlier, then we can jump on to the Maliki madhab, but is this case of, which I also alluded to in a previous session, but again, as I mentioned, there'll be overlap of content, but hopefully with each lesson there would be new information or content provide or more clarity on some issues. So what we're looking at is the popular qaida, which is framed as la inkara fi masail al-ijtihadiyya. So what we're looking at this session is, we looked previously at why there is ikhtilaf, right? Why there is ikhtilaf. We looked at that. And the various reasons why madhahib disagree, and that all why imams and mujtahids disagree. And part of the reason why imams and mujtahids disagree could be because of evidence has not reached them, which I said is usually not the first thing that a person goes to when it comes to a mujtahid. And it could be usually down to interpretation. The interpretation could be based on language. Interpretation could be based upon weighing up varying evidences. They come down to the idea of epistemology, how a person comes to know what Allah has said. So you can vary between the strength of a Quranic verse versus the strength of a hadith. And then you have the dalala, how clear is the Quranic verse and how clear is the hadith. These are all ways in which a person can determine what is khilaf, why there's khilaf. But what we're looking at today is how do we then deal with differences of opinion? And this qaida la inkara fi masail ijtihadiyya is what we're going to kind of delve into, and the discussion that Shaykh Saif al-Asri has in regards to that. So in a relatively short section, Shaykh Saif al-Asri makes the following comment, and this is like an addendum to some of the discussions that he's having before, where he makes a distinction which is called between tamyiz bayn al-dalil wa nas, a distinction between what evidence is and what textual evidence is. So he says, before we move on to that, he goes, فَالدَّلِيلُ كَمَا سَبَقَ وَمَا يُمْكِنْ تَوَصُّلُ بِالصَّحِيحِ النَّظَرِ فِيهِ إِلَى مَطْلُوبٍ خَبَرٍ وَأَمَّا النَّصُ فَيُطْلَقُ عِنْدَ مُتَأَخِّرِ الْجَدَلِيِّينَ عَلَى مُجَرَّدِ اللَّفْظِ الكتاب والسنة ويقابل حينئذ الإجماع والقياس وغيرهما من الأدلة ويذكر النص في باب القياس ويكون المقابل الإيماء ويضاف النص أيضا على حكاية الألفاظ عموما ويقال النص الشافعي والنص المالك. So the distinction that is between dalil and nas you can refer back to the raw data, and then dalil is where you're deriving what you're trying to take from that nas, right? So for example, we can sometimes have a debate, and I can say okay, let's say we're having a discussion or a debate regarding barriers. So is it necessary that when a person is to engage with a discussion with the opposite gender, must it be behind a barrier? Or can they have a conversation face to face, of course, assuming the absence of khalwa, because there's a specific text for that. So a person can say, well, there is a nas, and the nas is in the Quran. Allah Ta'ala says, when you ask the wives of the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, ask them behind a barrier, wala hijab. So now that's a nas, but now the question is that, what's the dalil part? The nas is there, so the dalil part now, so you may say, I've got a nas, the dalil part is that if that applies to the wives of the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, then it would apply to all other women more so. So that's your dalil. That's what you refer to as ما يمكن التوصل بالصحيح النظر فيه إلى مطلوب الخبري. So you're trying to say what? By looking at this hermeneutic process. So people say sometimes that this is a nas, so ayat al-Quran. I'm not saying it, that's fine, but you have to say, but you are trying to say something. So what is it that the verse is saying? So the verse of Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, so you're saying therefore it must extend onto other people. That's fine. That's your dalil then. You use that as the dalil. The nas is this, and this is the dalil that you're using. What could be tariq al-awla. But then someone can counter that and say, right, that's fine. But how do we explain the fact that there's numerous instances or communications amongst Sahaba, outside of the Azwaj Mutahharat, outside of Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, where there isn't a barrier? So does that, through the practice of the Sahaba, show that this was khas of the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen? So there will be a counter evidence to this point. So that's how the nas can be there, but the nas, the dalil is a separate aspect to that. So he mentioned that's something to keep an eye out for. After mentioning this, he says, وَخُلَاصُ الْقَوْلِ أن دلالة الدليل ثابت ورودا إن كان من قسم الظن فالاجتهاد في فهمه سائغ وإن كان من قسم القطع فلا مساغ للاجتهاد فيه. So for example, now if we stick to the ayah that we're looking at, who I just mentioned, that applying that to the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, we can say is qat'i, right? So here the khitab is to the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, and therefore the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen being referred to here is qat'i. So if I say Aisha radiallahu anha, is she Ummahat al-Mu'mineen? Yes, ayah applies. Salama, Zaynab bint Jahash radiallahu anhunna, you say yes, and therefore the ayah applies. So therefore the dalala on that instance will be qat'i. Then you extend that onto something else. The question now is that a qat'i extension? If the extension is qat'i, meaning this is the only meaning it can have, or the only valid meaning it can have, then that would then also be qat'i. If it is not the only valid meaning, this is a inference, or it's one interpretation alongside other possible valid interpretations, then that becomes in which something there is khilaf sa'ir, right? That becomes something in which there is a valid scope of interpretation. Now, naturally, you can see the problem here. The problem is sometimes a mujtahid is unwilling to accept that their interpretation is merely a possibility. Rather, they would argue that the interpretation is the correct answer. And this is not something that we should be considering necessarily intolerant, as long as the person who is trying to advocate such a position doesn't demonstrate stubbornness. But if there's a mujtahid who's competent and is very convinced by his ijtihad and says, no, this is the only valid interpretation when it comes to this ayah or this hadith or this mas'ala, then they are more than welcome to hold that position with some level of certainty. And they would say that the khilaf here is ghair sa'ir. I do not recognize that position. We spoke in the previous sessions about this, but I'll give you just this example again so we can highlight on this. A very good case study to look at, I'm pretty sure we discussed this last term. If we didn't, if we did, so I apologize for repetition. If you didn't, so I'll mention it, is the mas'ala of triple talaq. The mas'ala of triple talaq. In the case of triple talaq, what we have is triple talaq considered one talaq in one go? Is it considered one talaq or is it considered three? The vast majority of the ulama, such that many scholars have even claimed consensus upon this, they say that triple talaq is triple talaq. So this is called at-talaq mughallada, is separated. You can't, there's no, she can't come back to her husband except going through the known process. Whereas Ibn Taymiyyah famously held the view that three talaq is one. There is some precedence to Ibn Taymiyyah, but it's a very minority stance. Right? It's a stance of a very few scholars. And post Ibn Taymiyyah, it was also a very minority stance, but in the modern world, via the rise of Salafism, which is heavily influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah, the position now has become, I won't say dominant, but it has become relatively widespread. There's a number of scholars, students, Darul Iftaz, Darul Qadha around the world, they give fatwa or qadha in accordance with this. Now, the question that comes about is this a khilaf sa'ir or not? Right? Is this a khilaf sa'ir or not? Is there a valid difference of opinion or not? And the way you can test out a khilaf sa'ir, with the way that many of the jurists in the past would do it, is that if a qadi gives a hukm by it, would his hukm become nafid or must it be rejected? Right? So let's imagine, this is how you find out if something is considered khilaf sa'ir or not. You're living in a land in which there are various qudat, Muslim judges, and in one of these courts, a woman takes her husband to court and she says that my husband gave me 3 divorces in one go. The husband says, yes, I did. Right? What's the ruling? So he accepts it. Wife says it. We're confused. What's the ruling? The Qadi turns around and says, I take the position of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, or whoever he wants to attribute to, usually Ibn Taymiyyah, or I believe that the more correct position from the Quran and Sunnah is that you are not divorced. The 3 talaq should be considered as 1 talaq. Right? What should be the reaction to the ulama in that city, town, or what should they be telling the couple? Right? Now, if something is khilaf sa'ir, right? If something is khilaf sa'ir, then what do? We say, no problem, right? Hukm al-qadi, in this case, or hukm al-hakim, in this case, hukm al-qadi, raf al-khilaf. Once the qadi is given judgment, then accept it, right? If you're going to a Hanafi qadi, fair enough. If you're a Shafi qadi, you got no, fair enough. But in this instance, they've given a fatwa, a judgment which coincides with their position, which the scholars have not considered, predominantly in Hanafi madhab. I've seen from the Hanafi scholars classically that have discussed this mas'ala, they have not considered this khilaf sa'ir, but Ibn Humam, etc. And so they say explicitly about this scenario. So this is not I'm not inferring the scenario from other masail. They explicitly mention this scenario. They say the hukm of the qadi will not be nafi. Rather, it's our job to refute that, rebuke that, and try to overturn it. So therefore, your petition, you protest, whatever you can do within your remit is try to overrule that judgment and say we do not accept it. That is something that we are treating as khilaf ghair sa'ir. Why? Because number one, this thing goes against ijma', right? It goes against what all the madhahib have said, so that's authority away. And then other scholars who actually looked at the evidences, Ibn Humam being one of them, you even got more recent years, Imam Zahid al-Kawthari, and other scholars saying, based upon evidence, right? Based upon evidence, 333 talaq being 3 is a qat'i dalala. It's a qat'i dalala, so therefore the evidence that 3 is 1 is extremely weak, so we do not give consideration to it. Right? This is how we get to the origin of khilaf sa'ir was a ghair sa'ir and the implication of that in terms of real life. Now, just a few lingering comments, just to kind of wrap up on that point, is that without qada, then what do you do in that situation? Then it's just about trying to voice your opinion. So if you're living in the now, by the way, just on the mas'ala of triple talaq, there has been a general shift towards leniency in this mas'ala among scholars, because there are a number of senior ulama across the world that do give fatwa on this, that 3 talaq is 1. They are part of Darul Qadha, and so because of the number of them, naturally there has become a leniency towards this mas'ala. How to be honest, there's actually scenarios I can give which are quite similar to this. I'll give you one example. You have the discussion of must the imam, so I'll try to give a lot of examples here, so rather than just talking about in theory. So otherwise you can go into theory a lot, and two, unless you provide examples, one, it makes it more interesting, and number two, it actually helps you understand the case rather than just in a word of theory. So a good example that I can give here, which is something that now is not controversial at all,
is must the Khalifa be Qurashi? Right? Must the Khalifa be Qurashi? Because we have a clear evidence in multiplicity of hadith which say Al-A'immatu min Quraysh and other such wordings which says that the Imams are from the Quraysh. And you got numerous ulama, right? Qadi Iyad, I believe in Nawawi, I even believe these are claimed ijma', and you have numerous ulama just saying this is clearly the position. The Imams of the Quraysh is a shart for the Khilafah, and they have not backtracked on that. A few ulama like Imam Abu Mu'ali al-Jawaini and others kind of laid out some doubt regarding this principle. And as you go on, because we see a number of leaders, maybe not the main Khalifa, the Abbasids, but there's a number of smaller empires that have smaller forms of, smaller remits of Khulafa, if you like, that are not Qurashi, right? They are not Qurashi. And therefore there becomes a softening of the view when it comes to, is it really a condition, or is it a condition, or is it a point of virtue? So meaning the Khulafa, they should ideally be Qurashi, or if there's a choice between the Qurashi and non-Qurashi, the Qurashi be given preference. And so you start seeing a more leniency towards this view, and then eventually after the Ottomans become the superpower in the Muslim world, and they also eventually become called or adopt the term Khalifa, the view becomes quite shifted to now is considered quite a mainstream view to say that the Khulafa don't have to be Qurashi. Right? Qurashi is not a condition, and there's much more leniency when it comes to this. Even though, that being said, a number of scholars maintain this condition right into the modern period. The point I'm saying is that usually due to certain circumstances and something becoming widespread, a person starts to become more open to considering the evidences in this case. With the triple talaq, it's a bit different by the opponents, because number one, it's not within the four madhab, it's not from the four madhabs, so maybe certain scholars within the madhab, but it's not clearly not the position amongst the four madhahib, the four imams. And number two, one of the things that I always, so before I was like, okay, it's an authorities game, I get it, so you get the authorities, but from a pure evidence perspective, it's also, I believe, very weak. So therefore, the case of a person not recognizing triple talaq as being three, I do think is a very strong position, both based upon authority and evidence, but there is a general shift towards leniency, as I mentioned, because of the sheer number of Darul Qadhas in the Muslim world and scholars and ustads, etc., that deem this position to be correct. Okay. لا إنكار في مسائل الخلاف. Right, this is the point we're looking at. وهي قاعدة شهيرة عند العلماء. Sheikh Saif al-Asri says, this is a very famous principle near the ulama. ومنهم من يعبر عنها. There are some who articulate as follows: لا إنكار في مسائل الاجتهاد. There is no opposition in اجتهاد مسائل. Or الإنكار لا يلزم في محل اجتهاد إذا كان الاختلاف في الفروع. That objection, rejection is not binding in a place where there is ijtihad. If the ikhtilaf is in furu', right? If the ikhtilaf is in furu', here the distinction between usul and furu', again I recall mentioning this before, but just briefly, just so people can be on the same page again, because it's a very important point to note here, is that usul and furu', the division of usul and furu' into fiqh and aqidah is not the most helpful division. Why? Because there are masail in aqidah which are furu'i, and there's masail in fiqh which are there are masail in aqidah which are dhanni, and there are masail in fiqh which are qat'i. For example, the takbiratul ula, right? Takbiratul ula in salah and raf'ul yadayn is something that I believe everyone accepts. Right, that is part of the prayer, whether it's wajib or sunnah muakkada, whatever the case is, we accept as being part of the prayer. So this first, the raf'u yadayn in takbir al-ula is something which is qat'an part of the sunnah of the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if someone comes along and says, I don't raise my hand, or we don't have to raise our hand, even though we put that into the bab of fiqh, that would then become a qat'i issue. So therefore it does kind of delve into aqidah. Why? Because someone denies that, then you've denied something which is qat'i. So therefore it becomes wajib al-i'tiqad as well as wajib al-fi'l bil-ijma'. Or at least, encouragement of action at least, or part of the sunnah being it's part of sunnah being ijma', not wajib. Now, and there's masail al-i'tiqad, when we talk about aqidah, which are dhanni, right? So we have debates such as sama' mota. So can the dead hear? Can the dead hear is not a fiqhi mas'ala, it's a belief issue. Do we believe that the dead can hear or not? Right? Do we believe that the dead can hear or not? That's a Aqidah topic, whether we believe it or not, but the evidences for this are dhanni. So some evidence suggests that the dead can hear. Some evidence suggests that the dead can't hear, so therefore the ulama do ijtihad. Some ulama then agree that the dead can hear, and other ulama say the dead can't hear. So that becomes a dhanni issue in i'tiqad. So when we're saying furu', say furu' is meant as dhanni, and usul is meant as qat'i, that can apply across the board whether it's in fiqh or aqidah. Okay, just a bit more. Okay. So then another way you can say is these are different wordings that you find the same usul being articulated in. لا ينكر المختلف فيه وإنما ينكر مجمع عليه. That there's no objection in something which is differed over. Objection only happens in something which is a consensus. لا نكير في مختلف فيه. There is no objection, no rejection, no condemnation in something which is differed over. And then some of them also qualify this is that بعدم ضعف الخلاف. وإذا أدركنا أن الاختلاف سنة الماضية وحاصل لا محالة لأن طبيعة النص الشرعي تقتضي ذلك. Because once we understand that differences is part of our tradition, Sunnat al-Madiyah is part of the habit of human beings, is khilaf. We know we have differences. It occurs without any doubt because the nature of text, a shari'i text, necessitates that. The nature of the nusus al-shari'iyah is that it is not clear in every chapter. If it was clear in every chapter, there will be no ikhtilaf, there will be no madahib. كما جاءت نصوص أخرى أراد الله لحكم جليلات ورحمات سابغات أن تكون ميدانا تتسابق في فهمها عقول علماء. Because there are other texts which Allah intended for whatever great wisdoms Allah Ta'ala had, such as facilitating ease, etc., that has allowed the minds of the ulama to differ, to cross. وتتبارى في استخراج كنوزها العقلاء ولو شاء ربك أن يجعلها نصوصا لا يختلف في فهمها لفعل. If Allah Ta'ala wanted to make text such that there will be no ikhtilaf in, where everything is explicitly clear, is qat'i, then there will be no difference of opinion at all, ever. Right? We would all be in agreement on every single issue. So that's why there is always going to be nusus in which we the nature of the nas is that, so it shows that it's Allah Ta'ala who allowed the nusus to be like that, so therefore it is very much part and parcel of tradition that Allah wanted us to differ. Now the differences, and of course, are of two types. There's the differences which are or nusus which are there to test us, like mutashabihat. They're to test us whether we will accept them or we will use our hawa and interpret in accordance with our hawa. And then there's ikhtilaf, which is sa'iq, in which there is an allowance for us to differ, and it's actually come from the rahmah of this, the rahmah of Allah Ta'ala. Okay, so Shaykh Saif al-Asri goes on, he says, وَلِهَذَا كَانَ الْعُلَمَاء أَبْعَدُ النَّاسِ عَنِ الْجَزْمِ بِصِحَّةِ أَقْوَالِهِمْ فَضًّا عَنْ قَصْرِ الْحَقِّ فِي أَقْوَالِهِمْ. It's very important, listen to carefully. This is why the ulama were the most furthest of having certainty in the validity or the correctness of their position. Is that one has to remember that when you're giving a fatwa, you are answering on behalf of Allah Ta'ala, so therefore having jazm in what you're saying, because ulama are very far from that. فَضْلًا عَنْ قَصْرِ الْحَقِّ فِي أَقْوَالِهِمْ, let alone restricting the truth in their positions. كَمَا أَنَّهُمْ كانوا أبعد الناس عن استخفاف بأقوال مخالفيهم. Likewise, they were the furthest from belittling the position of their opponents. So although you do have examples of that, the tradition predominantly doesn't do that. So if you go to books of khilaf, of any madhab, right,
Even if you go to people that are usually, quite critical, like Ibn Hazm, or you go to Ash-Shawkani, you go to Ibn Qudama, you want to go to Jassas, you want to go to Ibn Abdul Barr, Badr Aini, Ibn Hajar, all of these ulama that mention khilaf, right? You find, yes, there may be parts in which they are very harsh, all right? There may be parts in which they are very harsh in where they deal with certain positions. Ibn Abdul Barr, rahimahullah, when he discusses the mas'ala of if a person intentionally misses salah and do they have to do qada or not, the position of the Zahiris, remember Ibn Taymiyyah adopts this position as well, that's after Ibn Abdul Barr. So at the time Ibn Abdul Barr, he's only aware of the literalists, the Zahiris who take this position, which is that if you miss prayer unintentionally, then you have to do qada, and if you miss it intentionally, then you don't need to do qada. Ibn Abdul Barr dismisses his position very outright and rebukes it, in essence. But that's not the truth. So you sometimes see examples like that. Ibn Hazm is very popular, where the way he sometimes phrases certain khilaf and he criticizes them. But that's not something which is found in every mas'ala, or that's not found predominantly amongst ulama. The general tone amongst khilaf is actually one of tolerance. And the general tone amongst khilaf is one that there is no jazm. You say, هذا عند أصحابنا, right? Or هذا الصحيح, or هذا الصحيح والله أعلم. Allah Ta'ala knows best. Some of the fuqaha, this is found in Fatawa Tatar Khaniya in the beginning, written by Imam Indarpati. He has this section, which is found in other books, it's just the one reference that I recall. He talks about when a person gives a fatwa, and you don't know if the answer is 100% correct or not, meaning you're answering something which is based upon ijtihad, then you should end your answer using the wording Wallahu A'lam. By saying Wallahu A'lam, you are highlighting that there could be some shak here, or there's some ijtihad here, so Allah Ta'ala knows best. I'm not saying there's Allah's approval on this. And if you're giving an answer in which something is qat'i, in which there is no doubt, so someone asks me, how many prayers are there in a day? Or something about Aqidah, will Isa alayhi salam come at the end of time? Then after giving the adillah of why Isa alayhi salam will come at the end of time, and I say yes, he will, or prayers are 5 times a day, then you can end the response by not saying Wallahu A'lam, because this is Allah has told us quite explicitly, quite clearly, without any doubt. So then we will say Wabillahi tawfiq. That is Allah Ta'ala who has given ability. Allah is the one who gives ability. So that will be the wording they use. This is from the adab of writing fatwa, something mentioned by numerous ulama, the distinction between Wallahu A'lam and Wabillahi tawfiq. He goes, حتى اشتهر أن من اتسع علمه قل إنكاره, such that it has become popular that the one whose knowledge has become vast, their inkar becomes less. Yeah, the rejection becomes less, because you start to realize that there is a lot of stuff that people differ over. And what you do notice is that those who are very intolerant, right, or those who are very quick to dismiss or do inkar on fiqh masail, you usually notice that their ittila', their awareness of khilaf is very minimum, right? It's very minimal. Rather, they have a very restrictive or narrow way of looking at the sources, and thereafter, when they are eventually exposed to khilaf, it's a job of trying to interpret those positions in light of the position already held, right? So he goes, it's popular, the statement, Man ittasa'a ilmuhu qalla inkaruhu, because you start to realize that there's many instances where you hear a position, you think, that's nonsensical, right? How can that be? And then you find out this is one of the Imam who said this, right? When I first heard of the mas'ala, that when you go to see a potential, Sheikh bin Baz had given, someone showed me, the Sheikh bin Baz gave a fatwa that you can see her hair, the head can be exposed. And so they go, how does Sheikh bin Baz, who's meant to be a very strict scholar, say that? And I first heard this years ago in madrasa, and I heard that, and I thought, that's quite bizarre. How can someone like Sheikh bin Baz, because the Salafi scholars are very strict on hijab. These guys, are very, they don't even allow, or most of them do not even consider the valid ikhtilaf on niqab. So niqab is clearly wajib or fard. So how does he say such a position when it comes to the propose the makhtuba, that you can see her head, her hair. And then I've read later that this is a position with the Hanbali madhab. And I looked at some of the Hanbali the books of the Hanabila. It's mentioned Al-Mirdawi's Kitab al-Insaf and others, that they mentioned that the head can be exposed, one of the position of the Hanabila, and something that many of them give fatwa on. What they give fatwa on now, I'm not sure, you're best to ask a Hanbali. But the point being is that it's there. So then the more you learn, then you start to become reluctant. So when someone comes to me now and says, guess what, this mufti sahib or this alim or this person gave this fatwa, what's your opinion of it? And now I've become very reluctant, not because I've got so much knowledge, but the fact that you try to read a bit wider and you start to humble yourself. You start to realize that let me at least be exposed to their evidence and see what they say before I condemn it. So I may sometimes with a bizarre position say, that sounds quite off. I would not do amal upon that. I would not advocate that. But I'm not going to do inkar of it until I see how they've come to that conclusion. I've weighed it up. Is it precedent, no precedent, or the precedent they're citing, does it have weight? What is the methodology they have adopted? Once you've done that and I see that it's way off, then I can start doing inkar. Otherwise, one should be cautious of doing inkar. وذلك أنهم يعلمون أن اجتهاداتهم في القضايا ظنية لا يخرجها عن كونها ظنية, because they realized, or they knew, that their ijtihad in dhanni issues does not make it go away from being dhanni. It remains, right, just because you've done ijtihad. ويعلمون أنه لا يلزم شرعا أن تكون أقوال مطابقة لما في نفس الأمر. And they know that the Sharia has established the fact that we can make mistakes. The Sharia established that their positions are not always going to coincide with reality. بل يكفي أن يغلب على ظنهم صحتها. Rather, it's sufficient that they may be relatively sure that their position is correct. ولذا أثر عن الشافعي أنه قال, this is why it's been transmitted from Shafi'i that he said, قولي صواب يحتمل خطأ وقول غير خطأ يحتمل صواب, that my position is correct with the possibility of error, and the position of the opponent, right, or the position of someone other than me is incorrect with the possibility of being correct. So that's what we wake it off. Then he says, وَأَمَّا الْجَهَلَةُ وَأَنصَافُ الْمُتَعَلِّمِينَ فَلِجَهْلِهِمْ بِمَآخِذِ مُجْتَهِدِينَ يَسْهَلُ عَلَيْهِمْ الْإِنْكَارُ وَالتَّسْفِيهِ لِأَقْوَالِ مُجْتَهِدِينَ. He goes, as for those ignorant, right, people with partial knowledge, ignorant people, then due to their ignorance of how the mujtahids operated, it became easy for them to object to and condemn, the positions of the mujtahideen. So when you have a very simplistic understanding, or you don't understand, so for example, when we realize that most of Imam Abu Hanifa's positions that he holds, even on those controversial issues, when I say controversial, I mean not dangerous, but controversial in terms of positions which go against the other madhahib majority, you'll find in most cases his position is taken from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, and Ibrahim al-Nakha'i is from the Tabi'een. So straight away, even if it was just Ibrahim al-Nakha'i who said it, that should, when you know who Ibrahim al-Nakha'i is, and you understand his maqam, and his relationship with the kibar, Tabi'un, and even some Sahaba, it should at least, for the person who has ilm, cause a level of pause to say, let me at least look into this, because Ibrahim Nakha'i was nobody. If you don't consider Abu Hanifa as being somebody, you would at least consider Ibrahim Nakha'i as being somebody. ولذا كان إصدار أحكام القاطعة في المسائل الظنية ليس دليلا على علم بل على الجهل. Because rather emanating or giving definitive answers in dhanni issues is not evidence of knowledge, it's actually evidence of ignorance. It's not evidence of knowledge, it's an evidence of ignorance. And on that last point, we'll summarize or conclude this point, this session inshallah, which is that, and I think it's a very powerful point, because most people, and I don't think people here listening to this, because usually if you're trying to acquire knowledge on a more advanced level, you appreciate the nuance. You appreciate that things are not as black and white. There are discussions in which there is some debate. But a lot of the laity, or people that are not engaged in knowledge, they want to have clear answers to all issues. Right? Clear answers. So forget clear answers to interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah. They even want ulama to provide clear answers to political issues. So they'll say, well, this is going on in the world today. Mulana Sahib, give us the answer. Ustad, what's the Quran and Sunnah's view regarding this? And they want to have an explicit answer, such as what they're doing is condemnable, or what they're doing is great. What they're doing is jihad. What they're doing is irhab, is terrorism, whatever. You want to have explicit, clear answers, whereas it can be very difficult, in some cases maybe, but usually it's very difficult. So therefore, the voices that usually become the most successful are those that are giving the clear answers, because they are giving you simple solutions, and it gives the person listening clarity. So they think this is dalil al-ilm, that this is evidence that this person has knowledge. But Shaykh Saif is correctly saying that, to the contrary, the one who's giving clear answers in all of these masail, one or two fair enough, few fair enough, but in all of these masail they have these very qat'i answers which are clearly dhanni, then that's for the student of knowledge and the alim. They will say, this is not dalil al-ilm, this is dalil al-jahl. This is evidence of ignorance, not evidence of knowledge. Even though that style of speech is very alluring, is very captivating for the laity. So therefore, it's our job to try to expose people to the grey areas, to say this is how the mujtahideen operated. They were not ignorant, and yes, you are going to have khilaf, even though you may not like it, but that's part of our tradition. Understand what are the dhanniyat and what are the qat'iyyat. Okay, so on that point, we'll stop here, and the next session, inshallah, we'll start the introduction Shaykh Saif mentions for the Maliki madhab, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.